Hey folks, Doug Blake with Body Design University. Welcome to another weekly study. And in this video, we're going to talk about ATP, adenosine triphosphate, the high energy universal energy molecule for life on Earth. And it's actually a pretty important question because there is confusion. I see it all the time about exactly what it is and what it's not. So got to be careful that we don't make ATP something that it isn't. We're going to talk about that today. But the key here is to get a very basic understanding of exactly what it is and what it does. ACE does not require you to know in-depth biochemistry, to be honest with you. I think page 205, pages 350, some of those areas where we talk about the sliding filament theory, ACE will definitely acknowledge the importance of the ATP molecule, but you're just not going to need, honestly, for the testing or in the real world, you're just not going to need to know a tremendous amount about ATP. It's important to understand that it is the final, it's the end product, right, that will provide energy at the cellular level for all metabolic processes. So that's critical, okay? It's the end zone, so to speak. Now, the idea that you can get ATP from different substrates and different sources is critical. What we don't want to do is confuse ATP with those particular substrates and sources. In other words, we do not want to call ATP sugar or glucose or anything like that. It's not an amino acid. It's not a protein. It's a basic molecule, and it has some basic components to it. And that's what I want to go over with you, just to make sure that we're clear about what it is and what it is not. So let me pull that up for you. And I want to make sure that as we go through this, I'm just going to draw you some pictures on the next page that we're really just trying to get a basic understanding of ATP, what it's used for, where it can potentially come from, and what it isn't. So there's the blank slate, right? ATP is what we call adenosine triphosphate, ATP. Adenosine, it's a molecule. Don't worry about what the molecule itself is made of. Normally, I just do an A, and that's the adenosine, right? So adenosine tri, meaning there's going to be three of these things called phosphates, phosphate groups, PO4. That's normally how we designate it. Phosphorus and oxygen. Again, look at me. I'm going to cross that out because it's not that necessary to know exactly what a phosphate group is. What's important to understand is that the ATP molecule has three of them. And I'm just going to write a P for phosphate, P, and P, right? So there is your tri, three. So adenosine triphosphates, right? 1, 2, and 3. So what's so special then about ATP? Well, here it is. I'm going to draw it, show it to you. It's right here. See this guy right here? This bond that holds the third phosphate group to the second phosphate group is what is known in chemistry as a high energy bond. It's a high energy bond. Remember in chemistry, you talked about hydrogen bonds and ionic bonds and all these things, right? Well, this is what's known as a high energy bond between the phosphate groups, which means that it's kind of teetering on the edge. If I could break that bond, boom, it releases a ton of energy, so to speak. And that's exactly what happens. The human body, right? Every living organism has an enzyme that's able to, or enzymes, multiple enzymes, to be honest with you, that's going to be able to break that bond. When that bond is broken, what happens? Well, this third phosphate group goes flying off over here. And then what you have left is an adenosine molecule with two phosphates, or ADP. I hope that makes sense. Right here, with the breaking of this bond between the third and the second phosphate group is a release of energy. And it's that release of energy that is able to functionally execute the mechanical work and chemical processes that are necessary for life to exist. Everything from the building of proteins to anything that involves some level of energy input is using that breaking of that bond between those two phosphates. Then what you have inside the cell, wherever it is occurring, is a free phosphate group kind of doing its thing, and then an ADP molecule. ADP doesn't help us a whole lot because ADP is not going, you're not going to break that bond between the second and the first phosphate group. It's too strong of a bond. So you're not going to get any energy from that. And so what the body does is what the body needs to do is what? What would you think your body needs to do now with the ADP and that phosphate group? Exactly. In some way, shape, or form, it's got to get that phosphate back onto the ADP. And it's a back and forth process of ATP, boom, energy, ADP, and phosphate group. Well, without getting into this, and I'm not going to delve into it. We've talked about it in other videos. This is where creatine comes in, creatine phosphate. That's why we call it the ATP PC or phosphocreatine system of energy production. It's not really a system of energy production so much as it's a resupplying of the phosphate group back to the ADP molecule. Creatine phosphate basically sacrifices its phosphate molecule, gives it back over to ADP and makes an ATP molecule. And boom, now you're at ATP. And I hope you can see how simple this is. It's a pretty simple process. ATP is broken. I'm making a mess of this, aren't I? The ATP molecule loses a phosphate group, gets converted to this, releases energy, and then creatine phosphate basically brings it back into play. And now it's an ATP molecule again. Boom, ADP, ATP, ADP. Every time that ATP molecule loses that phosphate group and converts into ADP, there's a release of energy. Boom, simple. Okay, very simple. Let's move on to another page. So, of course, the question then is, where does ATP come from then? Well, there's always a certain amount of ATP inside your cells. And let's be specific. We talk about muscle cells, right? There is a certain amount of ATP in every cell of your body. Your body is constantly converting ATP to ADP back and forth, but there's also the creation of ATP by other metabolic means, right? And this is where now we talk about the food you eat. Okay, so ATP, remember what I said, ATP is the end product. Okay, yay, that's what keeps us alive. But where do you get ATP from? Well, there are two main, this is why it's important to understand a little bit more about this. ATP is created, right, from two separate systems, two basic systems. One is what we call the anaerobic glycolytic system. I'm going to write that down. And the other is from the aerobic system known as oxidative phosphorylation. Woo, big terms, right? Don't be too worried about it. Electron transport chain, right? Those two main systems are what's going to create ATP. Now, here's where we can get real geeky, which I'm not going to get with you. Okay, there's ways that your body can get ATP from the foods we eat. There's ways you can get ATP from proteins, from fats, from carbohydrates in the form of glucose. The key here is to understand that these two main pathways, okay, of production involve anaerobic or without oxygen, what we call anaerobic glycolysis. And then the more productive, where you get a lot more ATP, more bang for your buck, with oxygen, the aerobic or phosphorylation, oxidative phosphorylation pathways. Okay, so when you're reading the ACE textbook and you're seeing all this, keep how simple this is in mind. When you eat food, it gets broken down, obviously, and the primary or the main source of ATP produced in your body under normal conditions is going to come from glucose. But ATP is not glucose. Glucose is glucose. It is a 6-carbon chain molecule, 12 hydrogens and carbon and oxygen and, CHO, right? So glucose is a molecule. When glucose, right? Glucose gets into the blood system and ultimately makes its way into a muscle cell, it will generally, generally begin its process of conversion through the anaerobic glycolytic pathway. It's like going down the road. It's going to go down here, anaerobic, without oxygen. It doesn't necessarily have to, but that's where we generally start with an explanation of this, through anaerobic glycolysis. Okay. And without oxygen, glucose gets converted into what's known as pyruvic acid, or pyruvate. And this process creates and generates a couple of molecules of ATP. But this is where it gets interesting. If there is oxygen, just as a for instance, that conversion into pyruvate actually gets pushed off to another on another road into what's known as acetyl coenzyme A. See, this is where we don't want to get too complicated, but just understand that there's different pathways for a substrate to move through to give us this guy. Yes, fat does get converted into ATP, but how does it do it? Through a process known as beta oxidation, right? You can read it in here. You can Google it. Beta oxidation is when free fatty acids are processed and converted into acetyl coenzyme A. We all talk about glucose, but really it's acetyl coenzyme A that is the sort of miracle mediator of potential ATP production through what's known as the Krebs cycle. So point is that you can eat food and it's going to get converted, if that's what it's used for, going to get converted into ATP through these two separate but conjoined pathways. And this occurs, of course, in the what's known as the cytoplasm of the cell, anaerobic glycolysis, right? This oxidative phosphorylation occurs just outside and then inside the mitochondria of the cell, right? And so that has all different permutations and explanations that go along with it. It's not necessary. Again, we don't want to delve too deep into it. I hope this part of it, I want to stop here just so you guys get the understanding of what ATP is and what it is not. It is the universal energy molecule, the fundamental energy molecule of life on Earth. It works by its special molecular makeup, which is an adenosine molecule with 3 phosphates connected to each other in a linear fashion. That third phosphate is ultimately going to be broken off of that molecule. And when it does that through enzymatic activity, it's going to release energy. That energy that is released is what's going to power all the functional, mechanical, biochemical activity that occurs in human metabolism, well, in all metabolism. Okay. What's left is an ADP molecule and a phosphorus and a phosphate group. The ATP doesn't do anything. We got to get that phosphate back on there so we can become an ATP molecule again and create this revolving process of ATP production inside the cell within that system. Okay, so that is one way that ATP is so-called created, right? In the ATP PC system, technically it's not creation, it's just conversion back and forth. And just keep in mind that system, that uses up pretty much all the ATP and the creatine phosphate fairly quickly. So that's going to need to be regenerated. And the next step in the process is the true production of new ATP molecules from glucose or whatever the case is going to be, depending on the substrate that's being used. By the way, proteins can be broken down. We don't want it to happen, but proteins can be broken down and used as a source of fuel, ultimately to create ATP. How? Through what's known as the urea cycle. That's a nasty cycle because it creates nitrogenous waste materials, urea, uric acid, things like that. And your body doesn't really want to do that, but it will. Okay, but your body can also use free fatty acids through the process of beta oxidation. And then ultimately, what happens? It all leads to ATP, okay? And so the production of ATP, I hope that makes sense. And then, of course, when we go back to the first page, we understand then how ATP releases its energy, right, through the breaking of that phosphate bond. Again, I hope this was helpful. Let me get us out of here so that we can kind of get the idea of exactly what we do need to know and what we don't need to know. ATP, adenosine triphosphate, converted to ADP, adenosine diphosphate. These guys are not the substrates themselves. They're not sugars, they're not fats, they're not proteins. They are the ultimate end stage of the breakdown of all those guys through these different energy producing pathways. Two main energy producing pathways: anaerobically without oxygen, and then the aerobic pathways with oxygen. And those generally occur just on the outside and then on the inside of the mitochondria. This is where we see the Krebs cycle, or carboxylic acid cycle, sometimes it's called, which ultimately feeds other molecules into the electron transport chain. Okay. And that's where you get a ton of ATP production. And then, of course, the ATP itself, right, is going to do and transfer its energy to ensure that all the mechanical properties, mechanical elements of metabolism, chemical elements of metabolism occur. I hope this was helpful. If you have any other questions about it, look, if you want me to go in depth into it, it can get a little squirrely because biochemistry can take us off the beaten path of just trying to pass the test. Because remember, that is the main goal. We want you to pass the test on your first shot. And if you've already taken it and failed, well, we want to help you to pass it on whatever attempt it is you are on. If you like the content, please subscribe to the channel. You can always just tap on that bell so you can get notifications. At Body Design University, our main goal is to help you to understand and ultimately pass the ACE exam. But we also want you to become industry-leading personal trainers, which means you got to take that information, put it into the real world, and we are more than happy to help you with that. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week. Thanks.